Okay, gotta say you've given us quite the challenge this time with this policy brief.
Oh,
Minilateralism on the South China Sea dispute, the Asian minus X plus one equation. Um,
wow.
it's pretty heavy stuff, geopolitics and all that.
Yeah, it sounds like you're diving into how these smaller nations, are trying to find their footing with all this tension.
Exactly, and this brief from the University of the Philippines, it's dense to say the least.
I can imagine.
But that's what we do here, right? We untack it all. So
Absolutely.
in this deep dive, we're going to try to figure out how this whole minilateralism thing could actually work in this region.
All right, sounds good. To really understand how this minilateralism could work, we really need to take a look at what's happening in the South China Sea.
Yeah, it's definitely not a peaceful scene out there.
No.
I mean, every time I turn on the news, there's another story about, the tension
It's a
rising.
very volatile situation.
Uh,
We've got China, kind of showing off its power more and more,
yeah,
and the U.S. seems to be, I don't know, losing its influence a little bit.
right.
And this whole power shift is making everyone nervous.
Especially those smaller nations right in the middle of it.
Yep, especially them.
And usually, people look to ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations,
Right.
to kind of, handle these regional issues.
Yeah.
But this brief says they haven't been so successful lately.
Hmm.
So what's the deal with that?
Well, you see, ASEAN, they've always been about, regional cooperation,
Right.
but they're really struggling to deal with these new security challenges.
Hmm.
I mean, there are disputes between the members. They have different priorities.
Yeah.
And then there's the big one, China's influence over some of those members.
Yeah, it's a
That-
mess. A tangled web for sure.
Yeah.
This brief even mentions like increased defense spending in the region
Oh, yeah.
because of all these power shifts.
Wow.
Makes you realize how high the stakes are.
Absolutely, and that's where this idea of minilateralism comes in.
Oh.
It's a much more focused approach to international relations. Instead of this huge group trying to agree on everything,
Right.
you have a smaller group of countries with shared interests working together.
Okay, I like where this is going. So how does minilateralism actually work?
Okay, so think about it this way.
Okay.
You're trying to get, let's say, 100 people to agree on where to go for dinner.
Oh, that's a nightmare.
It would be chaotic.
Right.
It would take forever.
Yeah.
But if you have a smaller group, like 5 people, and they all love Italian food,
Yeah, much easier.
yeah, the decision-making is much smoother and faster.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right.
So it's all about efficiency and targeted action.
Exactly.
But how do we apply that to something as complex as the South China Sea?
Well, this policy brief gives us 3 possible options for using minilateralism in this situation.
Okay.
The first one is what they call the ASEAN-only approach.
So like a smaller group within ASEAN working together to deal with China.
Yeah, basically.
Seems logical at first, but I have a feeling it's not that simple.
You're right to be skeptical. See, even within ASEAN, there's a lot of distrust, historical baggage, all that.
Okay.
Plus, China has a lot of influence within the group, so it's hard for them to really be united.
So even a smaller group might not be effective because of all that.
Exactly. And this brief actually talks about this thing called the TCA Indo-Malfi as an example.
The what?
TCA Indo-Malfi.
Okay, never heard of it.
It's basically an agreement between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines
Okay,
about countering terrorism in their shared maritime areas.
interesting. Did it work?
It had some success, with cooperation on the seas,
Oh, okay.
but it ran into problems with sustainability, not enough resources, that kind of thing.
I see.
And that was just for countering terrorism. Imagine trying to do that for something as complex as the South China Sea, with China right there.
Yeah, probably not going to work too well.
Probably not.
So ASEAN-only minilateralism is probably not the best option.
Yeah.
What's the next one? Bringing in the U.S.
Yeah, that's option 2. The U.S. leading the charge.
Okay.
At first, it seems like the obvious solution.
Yeah.
Right? The U.S. balancing out China.
Right.
But there are some serious downsides to think about.
Like what are the risks of having the U.S. step in directly?
Well, bringing in the U.S. could actually make things worse, escalate the tensions instead of calming things down.
Really?
Yeah, China might react really negatively, and then other countries might feel forced to pick a side.
And they don't want to do that.
No, they want to stay neutral.
It's like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, kind of.
Uh-huh.
And the brief uses this interesting comparison, the situation with the Mekong River.
Okay.
both the U.S. and China. They have their own separate organizations working on projects in the Mekong region.
So even in a different situation, they're not really cooperating.
Not really, no.
Yeah.
And now imagine that happening in the South China Sea,
Yeah.
which is already so tense with all these territorial claims and economic interests.
Yeah, sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It could be.
So we've ruled out Asian only and U.S.-led approaches. What's the third option? Is this the magic solution?
Well, the third option, and the one this brief seems to like the most, is the Asian minus X plus 1 model.
Okay.
It's basically a smaller group of Asian members, the ones most worried about China's actions,
Okay.
and they partner up with a powerful regional player.
Interesting. So not all of Asian, just a select few,
Yeah,
and they bring in a friend, someone with some weight.
exactly.
Who are we talking about here?
Well, the brief mentions Japan and Australia as possibilities.
Okay.
They're both strong allies of the U.S., they have interests in the region, and importantly, they're less likely to, set off China compared to the U.S. getting directly involved.
It's like a more subtle way to balance things out.
Yeah, exactly.
But why is Japan seen as a good fit for this?
Well, Japan brings a lot to the table. They have a strong military, they have partnerships in the region already,
Right.
and they have a history of, sharing costs with the U.S. on these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And lately, they've been more active in the South China Sea, showing that they're serious about security.
So they're not just talking the talk.
No, they're walking the walk.
So Japan could really provide that support to make this work,
Right.
but it's not about, like, going to war with China, right?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's more about having a stable presence, deterring China's aggressive actions, and encouraging cooperation and dialogue.
I see. It's about preventing things from escalating.
Yeah, and this idea of deterring gray zone tactics is really important here.
Gray zone tactics, I've heard that term, but
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what it means.
Okay, so basically gray zone tactics are actions that are kind of in between peace and war.
Oh,
It's like using fishing boats or Coast Guard ships to make claims,
Oh,
harassing other countries' ships, and slowly taking control without starting an actual war.
like a slow creep, expanding power quietly.
Exactly, and that's why this approach with Japan could be so effective.
I see.
By working together, these countries can have a stronger presence in the South China Sea and make those tactics much harder to use.
It's all about strength in numbers.
Right.
But this whole Asian minus X plus 1 thing, it depends on which Asian countries actually join.
Yes, exactly.
So who are the potential players and what does their involvement mean?
Well, that's a great question, and it's something we'll be diving into in part 2 of our discussion.
Okay, sounds good.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into minilateralism and the South China Sea.
Okay, so last time we were talking about this Asian minus X plus 1 model.
All right.
And how it all comes down to which Southeast Asian nations, decide to join the party.
Yeah.
You mentioned Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam as potential candidates.
Right.
It seems like each country would be bringing, I don't know, its own baggage to the table.
Absolutely. Each country has its own relationship with China,
Right.
different levels of economic dependence, different worries.
Yeah.
It's a complex web. So let's break it down. What's at stake for each of these potential partners if they decide to team up with Japan?
Okay, well, let's start with Brunei. They have a pretty small military, and their economy is really tied to China.
Okay.
Joining a group that's seen as opposing China could put them in a tough spot.
Yeah, they'd be walking a tightrope for sure.
Exactly. They want to protect their interests, but they don't want to make China angry.
Right. It's a delicate balance.
It is. Now, Indonesia, that's a different story.
Okay, how so?
Well, they have a much larger military, and they've been, more assertive about defending their claims in the past.
So they might be more willing to push back against China?
Maybe, but they're also really committed to not taking sides in global politics.
Oh, right. They want to stay neutral.
Yeah, they don't want to be seen as choosing between the U.S. and China.
It's like they're trying to navigate between two giants.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, Malaysia, they're an interesting case.
What about them?
Well, they have some overlapping claims with China in the South China Sea, but they've also been really eager to get Chinese investment for development.
So it's like they need China's money, but also need to stand up for their territory.
Exactly. It's a tricky situation. Then there's Singapore.
Oh, yeah, Singapore.
Tiny country, but a huge economic powerhouse.
Right.
They depend on free trade and open shipping lanes in the South China Sea.
Makes sense. Their whole economy relies on things running smoothly.
Yeah, stability is key for them.
So any solution that reduces tension and keeps the ships moving would be good for them.
Right. And finally, we have Vietnam.
Okay, Vietnam.
They've got a long and complicated history with China.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, and they've been the most outspoken critic of China's actions in the South China Sea.
So out of all these potential partners, Vietnam seems the most likely to jump on board.
It does seem that way, right?
Yeah.
But even for them, there are risks.
Like what?
Well, China is their biggest trading partner.
Ah, right.
Any open conflict could hurt them economically.
So it seems like putting together this Asian minus X+1 group would be a major diplomatic challenge.
Yeah, it would be a lot of work.
It's not just about shared interests, it's about all these relationships and internal politics.
Exactly, and this policy brief really highlights that it all depends on the political will of each country's leaders.
So even if it makes sense strategically, if the leaders aren't on board, it's not going to happen.
Right, that's the key takeaway here.
Okay, so we've talked about the risks for these Asian countries.
Yeah.
But what about the benefits? What would make those risks worth taking?
Well, the biggest benefit is that it would send a strong message to China
A message of what?
that these countries are united and serious about pushing back.
So it's about standing up to China without actually going to war.
Exactly. It's about creating a more believable deterrent to China's gray zone tactics.
Right, we were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, those tactics that are hard to counter with traditional military responses.
Yeah, it's like China's trying to change things without starting a fight.
That's a good way to put it.
So how would this minilateral approach actually work against those tactics?
Well, by pooling their resources, coordinating patrols, presenting a united front,
Okay.
they can have a much stronger presence in the South China Sea.
So it's about making those tactics too costly for China to use.
Exactly. It's about strength in numbers.
But it's not just about deterring China, right?
No, you're right.
There's got to be more to it.
This group could also be a way for these countries to cooperate on other issues.
Oh, like what?
Things like maritime safety, environmental protection, sustainable fishing.
Yeah, things that affect everyone in the region.
Exactly. And for a country like Singapore, which really needs stability,
Right.
this kind of cooperation would be really important.
So it's about finding ways to work together, not just about confrontation.
Right.
It seems like this model could create a more stable and cooperative environment in the South China Sea,
It could.
but only if these ASEAN countries are willing to take the risk.
It's a gamble, for sure.
It is, with potential rewards, but also potential dangers.
Exactly.
We've talked about the benefits and risks for the ASEAN members.
Right.
But what about Japan? What do they get out of this?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll be exploring in part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay, can't wait.
So stay tuned.
All right, welcome back. We've been digging into this whole ASEAN minus X+1 idea,
Yeah.
looking at how Southeast Asian nations, with a partner like Japan, could handle the South China Sea situation.
It's a really interesting concept,
Yeah, it is.
But like we've been saying, everyone involved has a lot on the line.
So much at stake.
What I find really fascinating is how this whole thing fits into the bigger picture of global power.
Right. It's not just about the South China Sea. It's
That's
about
so-
the whole world kind of shifting, right?
Yeah, it's like we're moving away from a world with just one or two big powers calling all the shots.
Right.
And countries like Japan, these middle powers, they're starting to play a much bigger role.
Yeah, it's like the whole balance of power is shifting.
Exactly.
So let's talk about Japan for a second. Why would they want to be the +1 in this situation? What's in it for them?
Well, for Japan, a lot is at stake. Their economy depends on those sea lanes that run through the South China Sea.
Right, for trade and energy and all that.
Yeah, if those lanes get disrupted, their economy takes a big hit.
So it's not just about, some abstract idea of being involved.
No.
It's about real economic security.
Absolutely. And beyond the economic side of things, they're also worried about China's military getting more and more assertive.
Yeah, not just in the South China Sea, but closer to Japan too, right?
Exactly.
The Senkaku Islands dispute, that whole thing.
Yeah, those islands have been a point of tension for a long time.
So for Japan, being a leader in this minilateral group,
Yeah,
it's a way to show that they're serious about security
right.
and that they're willing to, push back against China a little bit.
It's a way to show strength and influence
Hmm.
without actually, getting into a military confrontation with China.
More about alliances and partnerships than head-to-head conflict.
Exactly. And this fits in with how Japan's whole strategy has been changing.
Right, because for a long time, they were all about pacifism.
Yeah, they had that pacifist constitution. Their military was limited. They weren't really involved in things overseas.
But that's been changing.
It has, yeah. In the last few decades, they've started to take on a bigger role in regional security.
And this policy brief mentions some specific things they've done.
Oh, yeah, some interesting stuff. They're working on a new cost-sharing deal with the U.S.
For their military.
Yeah, it'll boost their joint military power quite a bit.
Okay.
They're also working with the U.S. on some high-tech defense research.
Wow.
And last year, they signed that agreement with Australia, the Reciprocal Access Agreement.
Right, which lets their militaries work together more easily.
Exactly. So they're building up their military and strengthening partnerships.
Yeah, it seems like this minilateral thing would be a perfect chance to use all that.
It would be, yeah. But it's not just about military power for Japan.
Okay, what else then?
It's also about using their economic and diplomatic influence, what we call soft power,
Yeah, that makes sense.
to try to shape things in the region.
So how does that soft power play into this minilateral group?
Well, by working with these Southeast Asian countries, Japan can promote this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific.
I've heard that term before, but what does it actually mean?
Basically, it's about freedom of navigation, open markets, democratic values, rules-based international system.
It's like a counter to China's more, I don't know, authoritarian way of doing things.
Exactly, and that's especially important in Southeast Asia, where a lot of countries don't want to be forced to choose between China and the U.S.
Right.
Japan, they have a good track record of economic cooperation in the region.
Yeah, they've been helping with development for years.
So they can offer a different model, a more appealing one.
So this ASEAN minus X+1 thing, it could be a good deal for both Japan and those ASEAN countries.
Yeah.
A way to push back against China, encourage cooperation,
Right.
and really boost Japan's position in the region.
It has a lot of potential, but we have to remember that the South China Sea is a complicated place.
Yeah, unpredictable, for sure.
There's still a lot of things we don't know.
Like, what are some of the challenges they might face?
Well, the biggest question mark is how China will react.
Yeah, they're not just going to sit back and watch, are they?
Probably not.
Yep.
They could do a lot of things: diplomatic protests, economic pressure, even more aggressive military moves.
And it's a gamble then.
It is a calculated risk. It could be a huge success,
Right.
but it could also make things worse.
That's geopolitics for you, right?
Yeah, it's never simple. The success of this whole thing depends on diplomacy, strong leadership, and maybe a little bit of luck.
Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about the South China Sea dispute, the idea of minilateralism, the motivations of all these players.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in.
Hopefully this has given everyone listening a better understanding of what's going on in the region.
I hope so. But we've really only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's always more to learn.
As you keep following this, think about how other countries might get involved.
Okay, like who?
Well, what about India? Their navy is growing all the time. Could they become a player in the South China Sea? What about the European Union? They're all about a rules-based international system. Maybe they'll get involved too.
So many possibilities. It's like a giant chess game.
It is a very complex one.
And the game's not over yet.
Not even close.
Well, thanks for guiding us through all of this.
It's been my pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into, well, who knows what.
Always something interesting out there.
But until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.